Hi everyone, welcome back to the another video. PLZ do 1000 subscriber. Like, share and subscribe. The night was cold and silent, the streets dimly lit by flickering streetlights. Keanu Reeves had parked his motorcycle outside a small diner on the outskirts of Los Angeles, seeking solitude after a long day. Clad in a simple black jacket and jeans, he walked toward the diner, his face hidden under the shadow of his cap. To the casual observer, he was just another man looking for a late-night cup of coffee. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet but tense. A middle-aged woman was working behind the counter, her movements hurried and her eyes filled with fatigue. A couple of teenagers sat in the corner, scrolling on their phones, and an elderly man sipped his coffee near the window. Keanu ordered a coffee and sat at a table near the entrance, his presence unassuming yet oddly comforting. Minutes later, the sound of screeching tires pierced the stillness. A police car abruptly stopped outside the diner, and a burly officer in his mid-40s stormed in, his boots echoing on the tiled floor. His face was stern, his eyes scanning the room like a predator searching for prey. He was Officer McAllister, infamous in the area for his harsh treatment of minorities and his volatile temper. The officer's gaze landed on Keanu. For reasons unknown, perhaps due to Keanu's quiet demeanor or his choice of attire, McAllister's face twisted into a scowl. He approached the actor's table, his hand resting on his holster. "You don't belong here," McAllister said, his voice dripping with hostility. "What are you doing hanging around this area at this time of night?" Keanu looked up, his calm eyes meeting the officer's. "I'm just having a coffee," he replied, his tone steady but non-confrontational. McAllister's suspicion only deepened. "ID," he demanded, his hand tightening around his holster. The diner fell silent. All eyes were on the interaction, and tension filled the air. The woman behind the counter froze mid-pour, her hands trembling as she watched. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket slowly, careful not to alarm the officer, and handed over his ID. McAllister snatched it, glancing at the name before sneering. "Keanu Reeves," he muttered mockingly. "You think you're some kind of hotshot?" Keanu didn't respond. His calm silence only seemed to fuel the officer's anger. McAllister leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I've dealt with plenty of your type. Quiet, smug, thinking you're above the law. Not on my watch." Suddenly, the officer's hand moved to his gun, and a collective gasp echoed through the diner. The elderly man near the window stood up, his voice trembling with fear. "Officer, please, he's done nothing wrong." But McAllister ignored him, his finger hovering near the trigger. Keanu remained calm, his eyes unwavering. "You don't want to do this," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with quiet authority. Before McAllister could respond, the door to the diner swung open, and another police officer rushed in. She was younger, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "McAllister," she barked, "what the hell are you doing?" The room held its breath as the moment teetered on the edge of chaos. The younger officer, her name badge reading Officer Clark, stepped forward, her voice firm but composed. "Put the gun down, McAllister. Now." McAllister glanced at her, his expression twisted with defiance. "Stay out of this, Clark. This guy's suspicious. Look at him, sitting here all quiet like he's hiding something." Clark's sharp eyes moved between McAllister and Keanu, quickly assessing the situation. She recognized Keanu instantly but chose not to address it. Instead, she focused on de-escalating the tension. "Suspicious. He's drinking coffee in a diner. That's not a crime. Lower your weapon before you make a mistake you can't take back." McAllister hesitated, his grip still tight on the gun. Keanu's calm voice broke through the silence. "She's right. You don't want to do this." For a moment, it seemed like McAllister might stand down, but his pride kept him locked in place. "You don't tell me what to do," he snapped, his voice cracking under the weight of his anger. Suddenly, Clark stepped directly into his line of sight, putting herself between McAllister and Keanu. "This isn't about him anymore, McAllister," she said coldly. "This is about you losing control. Drop the weapon." The room was unbearably quiet, the tension thick enough to choke. McAllister's hand trembled, his bravado beginning to crumble under Clark's unwavering stare. Finally, with a frustrated growl, he lowered the gun and stepped back. "Good," Clark said, her voice steady. Now step outside and wait by the car. We're going to have a conversation about this. McAllister glared at her, then shot one last venomous look at Keanu before storming out of the diner. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the room. Clark let out a slow breath, then turned to Keanu. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," she said sincerely. Keanu offered her a small, reassuring smile. "You handled it well. Thank you." The woman behind the counter finally spoke, her voice shaky but grateful. "Thank you, Officer Clark. That man's been causing trouble around here for months. Someone needed to put him in his place." Clark nodded, her jaw tightening. "He won't be coming back. I'll make sure of it." She paused, then looked at Keanu more closely, the realization of who he was settling in. "You're Keanu Reeves, aren't you?" Keanu gave a modest shrug. "Sometimes." A flicker of a smile crossed Clark's face before her expression turned serious again. "Well, you're lucky things didn't escalate further. But something tells me you would have stayed calm no matter what." Keanu's eyes softened. Staying calm is often the best choice. Anger only fuels more anger. Clark nodded thoughtfully, her respect for him evident. "You're right, but tonight isn't over yet. I have to file a report on this, and trust me, McAllister won't be walking away from this unscathed." As she walked toward the door, Keanu called out, "Officer Clark." She turned back, curious. "Thank you again," he said simply, his tone filled with genuine gratitude. Clark gave him a small nod before stepping outside to confront McAllister. Inside the diner, the tension began to ease. The elderly man approached Keanu, his voice trembling with emotion. "Son, I don't know who you are, but you handled that like a saint." "Thank you." Keanu smiled warmly. "Sometimes staying quiet speaks louder than words." The man nodded, his eyes glistening. The others in the diner looked at Keanu with newfound admiration, the quiet stranger who had diffused a potentially deadly situation without raising his voice. Outside, Officer Clark's voice could be heard, stern and unyielding as she confronted McAllister. The sound of her words carried a promise: justice would be served. But there was something else brewing, something Clark and McAllister didn't know. Keanu's presence in the diner that night wasn't a coincidence. As the tension in the diner settled, Keanu quietly sipped his coffee, his gaze distant yet focused, as though calculating his next steps. The faint sound of Officer Clark reprimanding McAllister outside filtered in through the glass door. It wasn't over for them, not by a long shot. The woman behind the counter approached cautiously, her hands fidgeting with her apron. "Thank you for staying calm," she said softly. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." Keanu looked up, his calm demeanor reassuring her. "You're welcome," he said gently. "Are you okay?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just shaken. That officer, McAllister, he's been like this for months. Always targeting people he thinks are beneath him. It's wrong, but no one ever does anything about it." Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly. "No one," she sighed, glancing toward the door. "Clark tries, but she's new, and McAllister's got connections. Every time someone files a complaint, it just disappears." Keanu processed this silently, his expression unreadable. But the way his fingers tapped lightly against the coffee cup suggested his mind was working through something. Before the conversation could continue, the door swung open, and Clark walked back in. Her face was tight with frustration, but there was a fire in her eyes. She approached Keanu and the counterwoman. "He's been suspended," Clark said firmly. "Effective immediately. I made the call to the precinct myself." The woman behind the counter let out a sigh of relief, but Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying Clark. "And what happens next?" he asked, his tone measured but curious. Clark hesitated, then crossed her arms. "That depends. There'll be an investigation, but like I said, McAllister has friends in high places. If this doesn't get the attention it needs, it could just disappear." Keanu set his cup down, his movements deliberate. "And if it doesn't disappear?" Clark frowned, unsure where he was going with this. "Then he's done. Fired. Maybe even charged. But that kind of outcome isn't common in cases like this." Keanu leaned back slightly, his calm gaze locked on hers. "What if I made sure it was?" Clark blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Keanu didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sleek phone. He typed something quickly and then looked up at Clark. "Give me your name, badge number, and the details of the complaints against him." Clark hesitated, taken aback by his sudden assertiveness. I can't just hand that over. Why do you need it?" Keanu's voice remained calm, but there was a quiet power behind it. "Because sometimes, when the system fails, people need to see the truth. And when they do, they demand justice." Clark stared at him, realization dawning. "You're going to make this public." He didn't deny it. Instead, he gave her a faint, reassuring smile. "I'll handle it carefully. No one will know where it came from." The counterwoman watched the exchange in awe, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're really going to do this? For us?" Keanu glanced at her, his expression softening. "Everyone deserves to feel safe. Sometimes, all it takes is the right push to make that happen." Clark exhaled deeply, conflicted but impressed. After a moment, she reached into her pocket and handed Keanu a card with her badge number. "If you're serious about this, fine. But promise me you'll be careful. McAllister's connections won't go down without a fight." Keanu slipped the card into his jacket and stood, leaving a generous tip on the counter. "Thank you, Officer Clark. I'll take it from here." As he walked toward the door, the counterwoman called out, "What are you going to do?" Keanu paused, looking back over his shoulder with a calm yet determined gaze. "What I always do, what's right." And with that, he stepped outside, his figure disappearing into the cold night. Inside the diner, Clark and the counterwoman exchanged a look. Neither of them knew exactly what Keanu was planning, but one thing was certain: things were about to change. A week later, the story broke across every major news outlet in the country. A leaked video from the diner, captured by the security camera, showed McAllister drawing his weapon on an unarmed man over nothing but suspicion. The video, paired with Officer Clark's detailed testimony and records of McAllister's past complaints, painted a damning picture of a corrupt officer abusing his power. What shocked everyone more was the follow-up story. The man in the diner, as he was initially referred to, was revealed to be none other than Keanu Reeves. His involvement was made public after a press release confirmed he had quietly funded a legal team to represent other victims of McAllister and ensure their voices were heard. Social media erupted. #JusticeServed and #Keanu for Change trended for days as thousands of people shared their own experiences with systemic injustice. News stations dissected the story, and McAllister's name became synonymous with abuse of power. At the precinct, McAllister's fate was sealed. He was fired and charged with misconduct and harassment. Those, friends in high places, couldn't shield him from the overwhelming public outrage. His name was disgraced, his connections severed, and his power stripped away. But the story didn't end there. Keanu quietly continued his work behind the scenes, donating to police reform initiatives and organizations supporting marginalized communities. He refused interviews and declined praise, insisting the focus remain on the victims and the broader changes needed in the system. At the diner, life slowly returned to normal, though the counterwoman never forgot that night. Customers often asked her what it was like to meet Keanu Reeves, and she always smiled softly, replying, "He wasn't there to be famous. He was there to do what was right." As for Officer Clark, her courage in standing up to McAllister earned her respect from her peers in the community. She was promoted, her reputation as an honest and just officer solidified. And Keanu, he returned to his quiet life, riding his motorcycle through the streets of Los Angeles, a calm presence in a chaotic world. For him, the goal was never recognition, it was to leave the world a little better than he found it. And he had. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that matter.